Picture this. The year is 1908. The Wright brothers have only just figured out how to keep a machine in the air for a few minutes at a time. Most people still travel by horse and cart. The automobile is a novelty. The idea of a flying machine crossing an ocean, let alone dropping bombs on a city, sounds like something from a fever dream. And then H.G. Wells sits down and writes a novel that imagines exactly that. Not just a story about airplanes, mind you, a story about entire civilizations going to war in the skies, a story about how a single spark of violence ignited from above can collapse everything human beings have built over centuries, a story about a world that destroys itself, not because it lacks intelligence, but because it lacks wisdom. Welcome to The War in the Air. If you've never heard of this book, you're not alone. Wells is most famous for The Time Machine, The War of the Worlds, and The Invisible Man. Those books tend to get the Hollywood treatments, the anniversary editions, the school reading lists. But The War in the Air deserves far more attention than it gets, because in many ways it is his most prophetic work, and possibly his most terrifying. This is a story about a young, ordinary man caught up in an extraordinary catastrophe. It's about aerial warfare before aerial warfare truly existed. It's about the collapse of civilization from the outside in and then from the inside out. And it asks a question that cuts right to the bone. What happens to the human race when its technology grows faster than its maturity? That question was urgent in 1908. It is even more urgent today. So, settle in. This is going to be a detailed journey through one of the most underrated books ever written. We'll cover the story beat by beat, explore the characters and the conflicts, unpack the themes, and at the end, talk about why this novel feels less like historical fiction and more like a warning that nobody listened to. Let's begin.
To understand The War in the Air, you need to understand the world that produced it and the man who wrote it. By the time he wrote The War in the Air in 1907 and 1908, the world was already trembling with tension. European powers were locked in an arms race. Germany was building up its military. Britain was anxious about its empire. The newspapers were full of talk about new weapons, new alliances, and the possibility of a war that would be unlike anything humanity had experienced before. And then there were the flying machines. In December 1903, the Wright brothers made their first successful powered flight at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. By 1906 and 1907, various inventors across Europe and America were improving on the design. Airships, enormous hydrogen-filled dirigibles, were already being built and tested, some of them by military powers. Wells was watching all of this closely, and what he saw alarmed him deeply. He didn't see progress. He saw a new dimension of destruction being handed to nations that were already itching for a fight. So he wrote this novel as both an adventure and a warning. As a story, it grips you. As a prophecy, it haunts you. Our story begins not in a palace or a military command center, but in a small English town. Our hero, and I use that word loosely, is Bert Smallways. Bert is young, cheerful, not particularly clever, and entirely unprepared for what is about to happen to the world. He works in a small bicycle and motor repair business with his brother Tom. They're struggling financially, as small tradespeople always seem to be. Bert has a girlfriend named Edna. He has dreams of doing something more with his life, though he's never quite sure what. He's the kind of person history usually ignores, someone the great events of the age happen to, rather than someone who shapes those events. That ordinariness is entirely deliberate on Wells's part. Bert is not a metaphor. He's a stand-in for the vast majority of humanity. Decent, limited, muddle-headed, and caught completely off guard by what the modern world is capable of. Wells opens the novel with a slightly satirical panoramic view of the era. He describes a world buzzing with change, new technologies, new vehicles, new possibilities. The mood is one of breathless optimism about progress. Everywhere you look, somebody is inventing something. The newspapers are full of marvel and excitement. Nobody is asking whether any of this is wise. This is important. Wells doesn't set up the coming catastrophe as something shocking and unexpected. He sets it up as the inevitable result of a world drunk on invention without foresight.
Things start moving quickly for Bert when he gets mixed up in a series of comic misadventures that feel almost farcical at first. While trying to chase after a drifting balloon, because he'd been in the basket for a joyride that went wrong, Bert ends up inadvertently stowing away on an airship. Not just any airship, this turns out to be the Vaterland, the flagship of a secret German aerial fleet. And this is where the novel shifts gears entirely. The airship belongs to Prince Karl Albert, an imperial German commander who is leading a massive, covert aerial attack across the Atlantic. The Germans have developed a whole new technology of war in the air, enormous war-zeppelins armed with bombs and guns, capable of flying faster and further than anything else in the world. Their plan is audacious: launch a surprise air assault on the United States, destroy its industrial and military infrastructure, and force a new world order where Germany rules the skies and, by extension, rules everything below them. Bert, this small, bewildered bicycle mechanic from a small English town, is now aboard the command airship of one of the most dangerous war fleets ever assembled. He's accidentally carrying documents that the Germans believe belong to a British aerial inventor named Butteridge, documents describing a revolutionary flying machine. The Germans think Bert is Butteridge, or at least his agent. It's a case of mistaken identity that Bert is too frightened and confused to immediately correct. This sets up an irony that Wells milks throughout the middle section of the novel. The most consequential war in human history is being triggered and shaped in part by a comedy of errors involving a man who fixes bicycles. The German fleet crosses the Atlantic and arrives over New York City. What follows is one of the most visceral and visionary passages Wells ever wrote. The city, a symbol of modern civilization, of commerce, of optimism, is bombed from the air. The German airships hover above the skyscrapers and simply begin destroying them. Fires break out. The streets descend into chaos. People flee. Entire neighborhoods are reduced to rubble. For readers in 1908, this was almost incomprehensible. New York, the financial center of the New World, attacked from the sky? The very idea was science fiction of the most unsettling kind. But Wells doesn't just describe the spectacle, he describes the human reality beneath it. He shows us crowds of ordinary people, Bert's equivalents across the ocean, who wake up one morning to find that the sky itself has become the enemy. No warning, no declaration of war that anyone ordinary had been told about, just destruction falling from above. Bert, watching all of this from the deck of the Vaterland, is horrified. He has no power to stop any of it. He is a passive witness to history being made in the worst possible way. The American military attempts to fight back, and this is where Wells introduces another layer of complexity to the story. The Americans have their own aerial craft, though less advanced than the Germans at this point. There's a chaotic mid-air battle above the ruins of New York City, and it's during this chaos that the battle lines begin to blur almost immediately.
Here is where the war in the air distinguishes itself from simpler war narratives. Most war stories, even futuristic ones, tend to follow a structure. One side attacks, the other fights back, there's a climax, and then there's a resolution. Victory or defeat, order restored, or order collapsed. Wells refuses that structure entirely. Instead, what happens after the German attack on New York is that the whole world erupts simultaneously. Asia rises. China and Japan, which have been watching Western powers dominate the globe for decades, launch their own aerial fleets. Vast armies of fighting machines fill the skies over multiple continents at once. Alliances form and dissolve almost instantly. Governments that were stable last week are gone next week. The war doesn't have a front. It has no clear commanders, no agreed-upon rules, no coherent objectives. It's everywhere. And because it's everywhere, it is uncontrollable. This is the key insight of the novel, and it is breathtaking in its clarity. Wells understood, decades before anyone had to live through it, that modern industrial warfare is not like the battles of Napoleon or Caesar. It does not respect the old rules. It does not stop when the generals agree to stop. It has momentum of its own. Once you introduce weapons capable of striking anywhere from anywhere, the concept of a limited or contained war becomes a fantasy. Bert, meanwhile, manages to escape the Vaterland during the chaos. He ends up stranded on an island in the middle of this global catastrophe, struggling simply to survive. His story becomes less of a political thriller and more of a survival narrative, which is another deliberate choice by Wells. As the grand strategies of nations collapse into incoherence, the only meaningful story left to tell is the story of one small person trying to stay alive. As the middle section of the novel progresses, the scope of the disaster becomes clear. It's not just that cities are being bombed, it's that the entire infrastructure of modern civilization is being destroyed. Trade stops, supply chains collapse, food becomes scarce, governments lose control of their territories, disease begins to spread. People who were comfortable and prosperous find themselves scrambling for basic necessities. The technological society that had seemed so invincible, so obviously superior to anything in human history, turns out to be fragile in ways nobody had anticipated. Wells makes a crucial observation here that's worth dwelling on. Modern civilization is enormously powerful, but it is also enormously interdependent. Every part depends on every other part. Electrical power depends on coal, which depends on railways, which depend on organized labor and international trade, which depend on stable governments and functional currencies. Pull out one thread, or in this case, bomb several threads simultaneously from the air, and the whole fabric can unravel with terrifying speed. This was not just speculation in 1908. Wells had been thinking about systems theory and social complexity in a way that was genuinely ahead of its time. He understood that civilization is not a robust, self-healing organism. It is a delicate, interconnected web, and webs can be destroyed very quickly. Bert Smallways wanders through this collapsing world, and his journey takes on an almost allegorical quality. He encounters pockets of survivors trying to organize themselves. He sees the remnants of armies that no longer have governments to report to. He witnesses the early stages of what will become a long, dark decline, not a dramatic apocalypse in a single moment, but a slow, grinding deterioration that takes years and then decades.
Eventually, Bert makes his way back to England, but the England he returns to is not the England he left. The towns are damaged, the economy has collapsed, the social order has fractured. The cheerful, bustling world of bicycle shops and aspirational young couples that open the novel has been replaced by something much darker. He finds Edna, or rather, he is eventually reunited with her, though the path is painful and uncertain. Their reunion is not triumphant, it is quiet, tentative, colored by loss. And then Wells does something remarkable with the final section of the novel. He skips forward in time. He shows us the world decades after the initial catastrophe. And what we see is a kind of neo-medieval dark age. Civilizations have contracted. Technology has not progressed, it has regressed. The great cities are ruins. People live in smaller, simpler communities. The science and industry that once seemed destined to carry humanity to the stars has been largely lost or abandoned. An elderly Bert, in old age, looks back on his life and on the world. He speaks to younger people who barely understand what the old world was like. To them, the idea of cities with thousands of buildings, of factories, of global trade networks and telegraphs and flying machines, it's almost mythological. The novel ends not with hope or despair exactly, but with a kind of exhausted melancholy. The world went wrong, Wells seems to be saying. It went wrong because the people who built its extraordinary machines never stopped to ask whether those machines would be used wisely, and the price was everything. Let's step back now and talk about what this book is really about,
beneath the surface of the plot. The first and most obvious theme is the danger of technological progress without moral progress. Wells believed deeply, almost desperately, that humanity was in a race between its capacity to create powerful tools and its capacity to use those tools wisely. In The War in the Air, technology wins the race. The flying machines arrive before the wisdom to govern them does, and the result is catastrophe. This isn't a simplistic anti-technology message. Wells was not a Luddite. He loved science and invention, but he was acutely aware that the same intelligence that creates a steam engine or an airship does not automatically create the ethical frameworks or political institutions needed to control those inventions. Those things have to be built separately, consciously, and with enormous effort. And in the early 20th century, nobody was doing that work. The second major theme is the fragility of civilization. Wells tears apart the Victorian and Edwardian complacency that assumed progress was inevitable and permanent. He shows us a world that seems solid and confident, and then he shows us exactly how thin the walls are. Civilization is not a destination you arrive at and stay. It is a practice, a discipline, something you have to maintain every day. Stop maintaining it through war, through negligence, through the blind pursuit of national advantage, and it falls apart faster than anyone imagined possible. The third theme is the ordinary person in extraordinary history. Bert Smallways is not chosen. He's not special. He doesn't save the world or change the course of events. He just endures. And Wells seems to be saying that this is the true human experience of war and catastrophe. Not heroism, but endurance. Not triumph, but survival. The people who bear the greatest cost of history's disasters are almost never the people who cause them. There's also a powerful critique of nationalism running through the novel. The Germans in the story are not portrayed as uniquely evil. They are portrayed as one expression of a universal human tendency, the tendency to conflate national glory with virtue and to pursue that glory without counting the cost to everyone else. The Americans who fight back, the Asian powers that enter the conflict, they are all operating under the same dangerous logic. My nation, my power, my destiny. And that logic, multiplied across every major power simultaneously, produces a result that nobody wanted and everybody caused. Finally, there is the theme of consequences. Everything in this novel has consequences that nobody fully anticipated. The Germans think they can launch a surgical strike and achieve dominance. Instead, they trigger a global catastrophe. Every power that enters the war expects to win something, and every power loses everything. Wells is absolutely remorseless in following this logic to its conclusion. There is no cavalry that arrives at the last minute. There is no technological deus ex machina that restores order. There is only the long, slow reckoning with what was done.
Now, you might be thinking, this sounds like a very sad and very old book. What does it have to do with us, sitting here in the 21st century? The answer is almost everything. Think about the parallels. We are living through our own extraordinary technological acceleration. Artificial intelligence, autonomous weapons systems, hypersonic missiles, drone warfare, cyber attacks that can disable power grids. These are the 21st century equivalents of the German war-zeppelins in Wells's novel. Technologies of enormous power developing at enormous speed, while the international agreements and ethical frameworks to govern them lag years, sometimes decades behind. The pattern Wells identified in 1908 is still operating today. We are still better at building powerful tools than we are at governing them wisely. We are still prone to the logic of national advantage, to the idea that if we don't develop this technology first, someone else will, and that's dangerous, so we have to do it regardless of the risks. And we still tend to underestimate the fragility of the interconnected systems we depend on. The COVID-19 pandemic gave the world a small, uncomfortable taste of what Wells was describing, how quickly supply chains can falter, how rapidly trust in institutions can erode. how a system that seems robust can reveal unexpected vulnerabilities when stressed. A global war fought from the air would do all of that and more, multiplied by 1,000. There's also something to be said about the media and information environment Wells describes. In The War in the Air, ordinary people like Bert Smallways know almost nothing about the forces shaping their world. They read newspapers that give them fragments of information, usually after the fact, and they have very little ability to understand the big picture or influence events. They are reactive, not proactive. They are spectators to their own history. Does that sound familiar? We live in a world of information abundance, and yet many people feel just as powerless as Bert, just as unable to grasp the forces shaping their lives, just as uncertain about who is making the decisions that will determine their future. The scale has changed, the basic dynamic has not. Wells also has something to say about the seductive appeal of power. Prince Karl Albert and the German High Command in the novel are not stupid people. They are, in many ways, brilliant. They have built an extraordinary military machine. But their brilliance is entirely in the service of domination, and they lack the imagination to see how their own actions will play out. Power that lacks wisdom is not strength. It's just a faster way to fall. That insight applies to individuals, institutions, corporations, and nations alike, and it applies just as urgently today as it did in 1908. Finally, there's the question of what kind of world we want to leave behind. Bert Smallways, in his old age, lives in a world that has lost most of what the previous generation built. He has memories of marvels that the younger generation can barely comprehend. The libraries are burned or rotted. The great machines are rusted and forgotten. The knowledge is lost. Every generation inherits a civilization. Every generation has the option of maintaining it, building on it, or letting it decay. Wells was warning his generation, and through them all future generations, that civilization is not self-sustaining. It requires conscious care. It requires the kind of ethical and political seriousness that keeps pace with technological power. Without that, even the most impressive human achievements can be undone.
So here is what The War in the Air leaves us with. It leaves us with a young man on a bicycle, full of small ambitions and everyday dreams, who watches the world he was born into destroy itself from the sky. It leaves us with the ruins of cities that were, just a few years before, symbols of everything humanity could accomplish. It leaves us with the quiet, aching image of an old man trying to explain to children what the world was like before, and finding that the children can barely imagine it. H.G. Wells wrote this book in 1907 and 1908. The First World War began 6 years later. The Second World War followed 20 years after that. Aerial bombing, which Wells had imagined in precise and terrible detail, became a defining feature of both conflicts. The fragility of civilization that he described became a lived reality for hundreds of millions of people. He was not a prophet in the mystical sense. He was simply a man who paid attention, who thought carefully about cause and effect, and who had the courage to follow his analysis to its logical conclusion, even when that conclusion was deeply uncomfortable. The lesson of The War in the Air is not that technology is evil or that human beings are irredeemably foolish. It is more subtle and more demanding than that. The lesson is that every new power requires new responsibility, that the gap between what we can do and what we should do is not closed by more invention. It's closed by moral seriousness, political courage, and the willingness to ask hard questions before the bombs start falling. H.G. Wells was asking those questions in 1908. They went largely unanswered. The bombs fell anyway. We are still living in the world those bombs made, and we are still, in many ways, facing the same choice that Wells's generation faced, between the intoxicating rush of new capabilities and the slower, harder work of wisdom. The question is whether we'll answer it differently this time.
The War in the Air is available to read for free, as it's in the public domain. If you've made it this far, I genuinely encourage you to read it yourself. It won't take long, and it will stay with you. Thank you for listening.